Did Saint Joseph of Cupertino actually fly? That is what this video is about. And today we're actually going deep. We're doing a deep dive into all of the evidence that supports his actually levitating. You'll be surprised at how much evidence there is. Skeptics obviously are going to have their objections. We're going to look at some of those objections. And this actually was brought about because we've posted just a day ago, we've posted a new video on our sister channel called Miraculous Mysteries. It's a full-length 28-minute documentary on the life and the miracles of St. Joseph of Cupertino. If you guys haven't seen that yet, I've got it linked in the description of this video. And this is supposed to be a sort of supplementary video where we're going to be doing, like I say, a much deeper dive into the evidence. And so to join me, I've got Caleb Jackson, who's actually my sort of chief researcher on this project, and not just this project alone, but we're working closely on all of the videos, the different documentaries that we're going to be posting over at Miraculous Mysteries. So Caleb, it's great to have you here. Can't wait to look into this one in particular a lot deeper. And why don't you just, if you've got anything to kind of say about this case up front, let's go ahead and just get into some of the details.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Cameron. Thanks for having me on. And I think, as you were saying at the beginning, this is based off of documentary that you posted yesterday. I really would encourage everyone to go look at that, not just because it helps in terms of this being supplementary to it, but because there was so much time and effort, and I can attest to this personally, seeing you do it, of how much work you put into researching this, writing this, editing this, having all of the materials there. It's very well produced, and I know that we're looking forward to hopefully doing more like that in the future. And so far, it seems like it's gotten really positive reception. So definitely would encourage everyone in the audience to check it out. It's different. There's just not much on YouTube, or frankly in general, either within the apologetics sphere or just online and generally speaking, that goes over the details of this. So this is a pretty exclusive take here. So hopefully everyone enjoys it. But yeah, we are going to be going over some of the more detailed aspects because people were asking for the sources and more of the details of the case of Joseph of Cupertino. So hopefully everyone's enlightened today as we go into that.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off of that, yeah, we have some really exciting documentaries sort of lined up. We've got a list of different things that we're kind of going to go through. And right now we're actually researching the third video. The second videos are currently in production right now. And the third video, we've just selected the topic and we're going to start to research that one. So super excited about this entire project. Like you say, the feedback on it has been incredible. Like, beyond anything that I would have expected. I had one guy reach out saying that he was suffering some really deep depression. He watched the video and did a 180 like immediately because he sort of identified with some of the stories, some of the aspects of the documentary itself, which was just incredible. Like, I don't think in my entire career online doing YouTube apologetics, I don't think I've ever received a note like that. So it's pretty incredible. Like, that alone, I think is worth doing the video and the entire thing. But the overall feedback has been very, very positive, which is kind of difficult to come by in this area. But I don't want to waste too much time. Let's go ahead and get into the details of this particular case. Again, we're looking at Saint Joseph of Cupertino, who is this 17th century friar, this priest, and he's his story is just remarkable. Some skeptics will even say that, like, they'll even use like a flying person as an example of, like, if you wouldn't believe that, if someone told you that they saw someone flying, if you wouldn't believe that, then why do you believe, the reports about the resurrection? So it's interesting that we actually have some really detailed accounts, and like numerous detailed accounts of someone doing that very thing. And so let's go ahead and get into it. You've got a presentation for us, right, Caleb? So let's go ahead, get into it. Feel free to begin whenever you want, and then if I have anything to add, or if I have any questions, then I'll kind of pause and kind of go along the way. But this is intended to be very informative for you guys. So I want you to plug in, get ready, get set up. If you need to pause the video and go put it on somewhere else so that you can really focus in on what you're about to listen to, this is going to be really, really good stuff. You may need to listen to it a couple times to really soak it all in and really understand all of it. But yeah, so with that set up, let's go ahead and get into it.
Excellent. Thank you, Cameron. And again, I would definitely recommend everyone checks out the video first if they haven't already, because it acts as a good summary. This is going to be a little bit more specific on some of the details, but that video is definitely a good starting point in this. Are we planning on doing super chats as well with this, Cameron, if people want to ask any questions about it?
If we get some in, we'll definitely take them.
Perfect. That sounds good. So Saint Joseph of Cupertino, before he was a saint, was, as Cameron was saying, a Franciscan friar in the 17th century. He lived from 1603 to 1663. And he's most well known for his ability to fly and levitate. He's actually the patron saint of astronauts and pilots, ironically enough. But it is, bar none, the best case in recorded history of what is alleged to be levitation. There are other saints like Teresa of Avila and others who have also allegedly levitated, but none of them really come close to the scale and the number of accounts that we have for Joseph. So a lot of people wonder, what are the sources for this? Because with a lot of the lives of the saints, you have hagiographies, which are written sometimes centuries later and are often very mythical in nature, right? When we're looking at historical sources, we want to be pretty close to primary details and resources in that way. So for the life of Joseph, we have at least 4 biographies that are relatively contemporaneous, written within 100 years of it. Our earliest one was written by Roberto Nuti, who was actually a friend of Joseph. I believe he was a former priest or friar. He wrote about 8 years, but that would be about 15 years or so after the death of Joseph. So within, lifetime of witnesses. And Nuti wrote from his own experiences. He did know Joseph personally, and of course he got details from other companions of Joseph, where he would get details of his life and his miracles.
So within 15 years, we get our first source.
Correct. Yes. First written source. And I should also preface by saying that I believe it was around 1668. I believe it was roughly 5 to 10 years after Joseph died is when the first opening up of the beatification process started, when people were first looking into making him a saint. That is when they started to collect what is called the processi. And the processi are the official sort of witness affidavits where so-and-so occupation was here at this time, claims that he saw this, swears it under oath, and he tells us to the inquisitor, and they keep this up. And they would have to test the credibility of the person, make sure that they weren't dreaming or hallucinating or was of sound mind, and all of those details. So the processi is where a lot of our primary details come from, and those were written roughly around 10 years or so, within 10 years of when Joseph died. So Roberto Nuti was using a lot of his own experience and talking to the companions of Joseph. When we get to some of these later biographies, a lot of them are relying on the processi. So we have Don Ariangelo, who we don't know the exact year he's writing, but it's a little bit after Nuti. But he's also a contemporary of Joseph who knew him, and he had spoken with some of the eyewitnesses. And he recorded in his book about 70 instances of Joseph flying to various degrees. And he stops at 70 because he explicitly says that he could have done much more than 70, but the book would be way too long. So he wanted to just cut it down, just to do that. So 70 is still quite a lot. But he was like, yeah, I could go on and on. It's kind of like in the Gospel of John when he has to say, Jesus did so many more things, but I have to stop because it'd fill every book in the world, right? He uses that hyperbole. By far the most, I think, prevalent and most cited and well-known biography of Joseph was by Domincio Bernini, who was the son of a famous architect and sculptor at the time, who wrote his Vita, or Life, of Jospeh of Cupertino in 1722. So now we're talking roughly 60 years or so after this. Some people are still alive who knew Joseph, but a lot of them are starting to die off. And Bernini is largely using the processi that were written about 50 years prior to the book, closer to the life of Joseph. And here he has detailed footnotes in terms of which ones he's using, who the witnesses were, when the event happened and stuff. So he's assembling a bibliography of sorts of the primary testimonies that we have at the time. And then
so, the processi, do we actually have that?
I believe that they are quoted. Yeah, I think that they are probably in the Vatican, as far as I know. I don't know if they're published, easily available online. They're also, from the 18th century 17th century, and are in Italian. Right. So they're not the easiest things to come by. But from the parts that I have seen, they do usually cite them, or at least have them in footnotes. But I believe I believe the original ones are probably in the Vatican archives, so far as I know.
Okay, so these are nevertheless really good sources because they quote the processi, which was written around 10 years after his death. So, yeah,
correct. Yeah, and again, we're still talking within a generation of that. So these are people who knew Joseph, who would have been alive. It's you have 3 biographies, like you're writing about World War II, and by 2005 you have at least several books written, which you'd be able to do with people who were still alive at the time in that way. So.
And we're just talking about these are just the sources, right? We haven't even gotten into the miracles and all the crazy stuff that actually was reported in these things. But this is just to show you I mean, this is one of the reasons why this whole thing is even interesting in the first place. Like, why are we even talking about this? 300 years later, because what we're about to get into, the actual signed affidavits, what people actually witnessed and saw, and these eyewitnesses, that's what's so crazy. And there's so many of them. It's not like we have like one or two people who say that they saw something. No, it's from like thousands of people who purportedly
Correct. From the
witnessed
estimates
this
that
guy.
Yes, sorry, I think there's a lag. From the estimates that I've seen, there's roughly about 150 different accounts from eyewitnesses in terms of the levitations. I think that's just the levitations. I don't think that's including the other miracles as well, so it could be well more than that, so far as I know, in that way. And I'll just point out the last two, 1753, these were written during the canonization. We have two more biographies. Paolo Antonio's, his is not as good. It mostly just, he uses Bernini's book as his main source, and when he has other details, he doesn't always cite them, so his is probably not nearly as reliable. But you do have Angelo Pastrovici's book, which I have written and I have there. It's also available online in English in the Internet Archive. It's a more recent edition if you're curious to read it. And he does, at the beginning, have the footnotes of the processes, and he also does use Bernini's book, but he does add some of the details from out of the text. So we have at least 4 or 5, I would say biographies of varying quality, but nonetheless sufficient quality, that all talk about Joseph's life as a friar who was performing miracles and levitating. So these are not stories that were written hundreds of years later that are later legends. These are mostly stories that are grounded by eyewitness testimony of people from many, many different walks of life, and we will get into that more. So I think that's a good backdrop as we move on from that.
Yeah, and then one of the questions we're going to address is just like, what do you do with this eyewitness testimony? That's what we'll kind of do toward the end of this. I should have also mentioned that we're going to try to provide our own assessment. Like, we've created a sort of plausibility scale, and we're going to use that to try to, I don't know, come up with a sensible way of determining whether or not this actually happened. We'll get to that a little bit later on in the stream, but just wanted to highlight that if you guys want to stick around until that point. We are going to address also skeptical objections a little bit toward the end of this. So stay tuned. I mean, this is all super informative, but we'll get to some more of the skeptical stuff a little bit later on.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you pointing that out, Cameron. We're trying to be as objective as we can. And I've said this before on your channel, but I'm not a Catholic myself. I'm a Christian, but I'm a Protestant. So when it comes to some of these Catholic saint miracle claims, I am a little bit skeptical, and I do try to have that, but I also try not to have my biases get in the way and not to be so closed-minded. So that's why I do find this interesting. And I ask everyone in the audience, whether they're Catholic, Christian, atheist, what have you, to just be open-minded regardless of that, and try not to let your biases get in the way. And it's not completely possible, but we can at least try the best we can. So I'll just point out 2 academic analyses. These are not contemporary works, but they are sort of the scholarly approaches to this, where they go over the sources in detail. The one on the left here, this is a stock image of a book. I could not for the life of me find the actual photo of it, because I could see online copies, but it's just very obscure. But it's Gustavo Paracini's, that translates to say Jospeh of Cupertino in Light of New Documents. And this is, I think, as far as I know, by far the biggest book. It was written in 1963, but he deals with over 1,000 pages in his book on pretty much every biography of Joseph. And the subtitle to that, In Light of New Documents, is because he actually went and found in some of the old monasteries in Italy, he found primary documents on Joseph that were not previously known, that had not been talked about in the other, contemporary biographies. So he talks about those in his book as well. So it's really interesting. I think a good popular awesome. Level book that would be good is Michael Grosso's Man Who Could Fly. I have that one online. It's a good overview. He also talks about other levitation cases as well. I believe Grosso is a parapsychologist, so he doesn't approach it from a purely religious perspective, but he actually thinks that Joseph had some weird human ability to fly that's just really rare. I know it doesn't really make much sense, but he is convinced that Joseph really did fly, but he was like, explanation-wise, maybe it's just some weird phenomenon. And then the most recent one, and the one that I know Cameron's familiar
He's an
with,
alien.
Yeah, he's an alien.
He's an alien from another planet.
Exactly.
He gets his power from the sun.
Yeah, he's Superman, right, exactly. And then we have They Flew by Carlos Ayer, who Cameron interviewed in the documentary for those who've seen it. Yale historian. And the fact that this book is published by Yale University Press also shows you that this is something that scholars, take seriously. I mean, they're not always just all accepting it's a miracle per se, but this is not something that's just written off and you can't take this seriously. There are credible
Yeah.
historians and very prestigious presses that have written about this. I do have the copy here, by the way, for anyone who can get on
Oh
Amazon.
man, I should have had mine ready. I've got mine on my bookshelf somewhere.
Yeah, and I also just point out that Ayer also talks. He does talk about Joseph of Cupertino for a few chapters, but he also talks about Teresa de Avila, who also allegedly levitated. He talks about Maria de Agreda, who allegedly biolocated, in other cases like that. So
Bilocated, not biolocated.
Bilocated, yes, thank you. I think on that biolocated probably a good bet. But bilocation, for those who don't know, is when someone's allegedly in two places at once. It's sort of like teleporting, but they don't actually leave one spot. They are there and then they're seen somewhere else at the same time. So it's sort of like a duplication, almost like an apparition, like a I'm trying to remember the term, like astral projection, almost kind of thing, in that way. But that's a different case. But as we will go into, Joseph did allegedly do all of those things. So Joseph's alleged miracles, his most well-known ones
you've even got it wrong here, biolocation.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. I put biolocation instead of bilocation, so I appreciate pointing that out. But it's all fine. We all make mistakes, so it's good. This is why it's life. So, but anyway, so Joseph's flights and levitations are obviously the most well-known and what he's most famous for. And the most well-documented one. But there's also ones that are pretty standard with other saints. You have faith healings, different accounts of that. You have resurrection, particularly of animals. There's at least one account that we mentioned in the documentary where Joseph allegedly raises a flock of sheep from the dead that were killed by hail. There's divination. Joseph allegedly predicted the death of one of the popes, where someone came to him and he said, I had a vision that the pope is sick and is dying. And the same day, the Pope died. And of course, remember, this is in the 1600s when communication was much more delayed. So the fact that he would know something from literally thousands of miles away is pretty, or hundreds if it's in Italy, is pretty impressive. Bilocation, dropping the ale there. There are accounts where Joseph would appear to people from one location. In particular, there was one account where his mother was dying of an illness, and Joseph was praying in his cell in his monastery that he wishes he could see her one more time. And one of the friars there testified that they saw Joseph just go into an ecstasy state. At the same time, we have witnesses from the household of Joseph's mother who basically saw him appear and saw the mother cry out that she saw Joseph there. And Joseph would wake up again and then tell his friar that he had seen his mother one last time and said goodbye to her. So that would be another alleged case of bilocation in that sense. Then you have perfume, or the odor of sanctity. I have that on there twice. But it's a really weird and specific one, but it's also common with the saints where they would have this unnatural scent of smelling good. It's almost like smelling like flowers. Now, you could say, well, they could have had cologne or perfume, but this would be a stench that would linger for a long, long time. There's a whole chapter in Roberto Nuti's book where he talks about cases of witnesses who claim that Joseph would touch things or enter a room and he would leave, and the smell of that perfume would be there for literally like days, months on end, sometimes years on end after that. So kind of weird stuff like that. It's usually associated with holy people. And I have durability on here as well because there are some cases where Joseph seems to be unscathed by sharp objects or fire. That's why I have candles up there. There's one case where he allegedly on Christmas Eve levitated up to an altar in a dazed state and was basically hovering right above the candles on the altar, but it didn't set his clothes on fire, didn't burn him, didn't have any reaction to it. He was just dazed out of it. So that would be another example of one of the many cases of that. But do you have any other questions, Cameron, before we go into sort of the general life story and the summary of that?
No, I was going to say, go back to that slide. I was going to say, dude, I mean, like, you just look at any of these things and each one of them individually, you'd be like, okay, this is super unlikely. This is super unlikely. This is super unlikely. But then we've got all of them together. This one person did, allegedly all of these things together. And you're just like, what is going on? We'll get to the analysis, a little bit later on, but that's the thing that struck me is like miracles in general, at first you've got to assess them. You've got to understand that when you're approaching a miracle case, you've got to approach it with some like a healthy dose of skepticism before you just like affirm that any old testimony is going to do. You've got to investigate. You've got to do your due diligence here, and that's obviously what we're trying to do here. But yeah, it's just that's what kind of struck me. It's like each one of these individuals, like that's the only thing that we had about him that would be incredible. But then we've got all of them together in one person, and it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and especially if you're going to posit some kind of unknown human ability, which I know we'll get into. But it's like you're not just positing one power of flight; you're positing quite a few. If you're taking all these testimonies at face value, which of course is a big if for many people. And not all of the details are as well evidenced, right? Like I think the resurrection account, I think is just one account, but the perfume accounts and the faith healing, there's more accounts. The levitation accounts, there's more. So they're not all equally attested. They're, some of them are more common than others, but nonetheless, the fact that we have all these testimonies here with some very wide range of witnesses, Joseph was certainly a very unique person in history, regardless of what you think of that. So as we had briefly gone over in the doc, although we didn't get into all of the specifics here, just to give the lowdown, Joseph was born in 1603. He was originally raised as a poor boy, and he was considered to be very stupid, to put it quite bluntly. The nickname for him was boca aberta, or open mouth, because he would just kind of keep his mouth open in almost like a dazed state, like when you're like daydreaming and just like mouth. We even use the term like mouth breather as an insult, right? It's kind of like that. So he was very clumsy. As a teenager, he wanted to join a particular sect, a particular monastery. I think it was the Capuchin order. And he left there after just a few months because he broke plates. He couldn't do virtually any chore without messing it up. And he got really just disliked and was kicked out. And he was heartbroken because
not to cut you off, but let's kind of move forward a little bit quicker through the let's get to the miracles, because the audience can actually just go watch that in the documentary where we talk about like his kind of upbringing and stuff. That was actually one of my favorite parts of the documentary itself. So if you guys want to learn more about like his earlier life and like how he was kind of like clumsy and stuff, I would just recommend watching the documentary. I didn't mean to cut you off and stuff. I felt like the documentary did such a beautiful job of laying all that out. I didn't want to just spoil it all right here. I want to encourage people to go watch that.
Yeah, and certainly the documentary does it more eloquently than I can. So yeah, but anyway, long story short, Joseph becomes a priest. He gets initiated into it, and 2 years after that, as he's in this system of deep religious devotion, he does his first levitation during the feast of Saint Francis Assisi, which we have in the documentary. And after several levitations over the course of the next 8 years, the Inquisition is dumbfounded by this. They don't know if this is demonic and Joseph is using witchcraft, or if Joseph is trying to bring attention to himself. So we climax the documentary by having Joseph telling the story of when he goes to Rome and actually levitates in front of the Pope, which I'll go into more here because I have a slide on it. But we do have that, and that's where the documentary cuts off. But the story of Joseph goes well beyond that as well.
Right.
After he levitates in front of the Pope, he basically gets relocated many, many times throughout his life. So he's moved to Assisi originally. That's the longest stay he has. And while he's in Assisi is when he gets probably the most famous. It's when all of the people from Europe, all the big dignitaries and royalty come, because he becomes this, popular celebrity, this local celebrity in there that they want to see. And that eventually gets so crowded to where he's moved to Pietrubia. And he only lasts 1 month there because it got so out of hand when they moved him. The people there, the locals, found out he was there, and they would literally tear the walls down, climb the roof, and break holes in the roof to see Joseph levitate, because he would levitate almost on a daily basis, even especially during Mass. He would go into an ecstasy. That's another thing, too, I think we need to point out, is Joseph wasn't, flying up in the air and just having conversations like Peter Pan or something. He would usually be frozen in a dazed state, looking up at the sky with his mouth open, and just be like locked in a sense of ecstasy, almost like he was not in his body. He was between heaven and earth during these instances. And he would be lifted off the ground, sometimes just a few inches, sometimes several feet, for different durations. And so it was during these moments when he was locked in ecstasy that people would crowd him and see this.
I think Air also mentioned that like his clothes would be frozen too, like, right, not just his expression, but his clothes would be like frozen in the air.
Yes, yeah, and we can get into that too when on the skeptical explanations, because there's an interesting point on that. But people would come down, and in the cases where he would be a few inches off the ground, they would come, and of course he was not responsive to this, but people would literally get like, this sounds cruel, but they would pinch him, they would get needles and prick him just to see if he would react, and he wouldn't. People would even blow on him and he would float slightly each way. It's actually kind of crazy when you describe it like that. But obviously this got out of hand very quickly, and Joseph always hated this too. These visions were not on command. These were almost always involuntary. So Joseph would wake up basically and be embarrassed by a lot of this and run back in this way. And sometimes Joseph would even almost appear like he was frozen in time. There were cases where he was giving mass and reciting the Latin prayer, and he would freeze up mid-sentence there, float there for 30 minutes or so, and then snap right back, finish exactly where he stopped in the prayer as if no time had passed. So very, very weird in terms of how this whole thing allegedly played out. But anyway, this got to be such an issue with the medieval paparazzi, as I call it, that he had to get moved again just a month later to Fossombrone. And he stayed there for a few more years. And then one last time he was moved to Osimo. And Osimo is the last convent he was in until he died a few years after that. So I have the general timeline out there. But I thought it'd be interesting to go into some of his more well-known flights. Some of these are in the documentary. Most of these are not. And going over just some of the details of them. Did you have any other points before we get into this, Cameron?
No. The thing that occurred to me, I mean, I guess I do actually have a point, but the thing that occurred to me is that, I mean, once you start to look into the details of this case, at front you hear this guy flew, and you're like, okay, that's dumb, right? Like no one flies, like there's no flying people. But then you start to learn the details of this case, and you hear, for example, the story that you just told, where he got relocated and people were tearing down the walls to see him levitating, and that's like, why were people doing this? How do you explain that? Why were they trying to tear down the walls if nothing was happening? If he was just sitting there, or if they were
Right.
like, if there were cables in the room and he was being lifted up and it was fake, like why would people be tearing down walls to do that? So the more you learn about this case, the more you realize why it's like a thing in the first place, and why you think it's like, it is actually credible. Like it really is credible. But then what do you do
Right.
with that? And again, we're going to talk about that later.
Exactly. And it's also, and that's another point too, is that this is not something that the Catholic Church was parading as, look at our cool miracle, like, right, that you would think. This was something that they actually were,
Right. They were trying
if
to
not
hide him.
embarrassed. Yeah, they did not want this. They thought, I mean, it was a distraction, obviously. Mass would take 3 times as long, and Mass can already be long enough as it is, because he would freeze up in these states, and people would get so distracted and worked up by this, especially if they were, tourists or locals who had never seen this before, that it just became such a burden and a nuisance. And they just, they didn't want to take away Joseph's right to do the Eucharist, because it's an important right as a priest, but it obviously became an issue. So that's why they had to move him so many times. And when he was in Osimo, he actually was basically locked away in a cell, not like in a prison cell, but in Osimo, he was virtually completely cut off from almost anyone visiting at that point. And when he was moved, they didn't tell people they were moving him. Local gossip got out that Joseph was in this area now, and people would follow him. So it was very much unwelcomed, and the church did not encourage this. And they specifically told Joseph to stop doing this, and Joseph said, I can't, because he didn't do this voluntarily. This would just slip into this when he was in religious ecstasy. So because they couldn't stop him, they were just trying to hide him. So that just adds another weird layer to this. He was almost the first victim of fame in that way, but it is just fascinating to see the details of that way out.
Sorry guys, I don't know what happened. My software like wigged out and did something weird, so I've got to relocate all this weird stuff. Sorry guys.
Yeah,
Everything went all weird. Yeah, you're like tiny. All right, there it goes. Looks a little bit better now. Okay. Man, there was something else I was gonna say, but that threw me off. So yeah, let's go ahead and continue through the presentation.
Yeah. So all of these are his levitations, but some of them do involve a combination of other miracles, like this particular one. I do not know the exact year that this took place, but this is, and I'm not going to read verbatim the text. You can read it and pause it if you want, but I am quoting from these biographies when they were quoting from the processi or summarizing the processi, if you're curious. But there is one particularly well-known account that's often depicted in art where Joseph sees men carrying these big metal crosses for display. And so Joseph, in a feat of ecstasy, would fly about, 13, the crosses were 13 feet in the air in terms of the height of them. And so Joseph, when he saw this, was taken up in such emotion of seeing the cross and Calvary of Christ crucified that he flew 80 paces, about 200 feet as a distance, up to the cross, grabbed it. Again, this is a big 13-foot metal cross that required several men to hold, and just put it in I don't know what the post. where it's supposed to be placed because these men were struggling to put it in there with that as if it were straw, like it was nothing. So that would be one case of not only just extraordinary, flight, but also strength in that way, to where he's holding something that's extremely heavy and just putting it down as if it's nothing while up in the air. And this is attested to by the laborers who were there, and they were in shock. Joseph would usually scream when he would do these things. It would actually terrify people because he would run, scream, be in a sense of ecstasy, and sometimes be frozen up there or sometimes be moving really fast. And in the case he was here. So another case you have that involves multiple things is the healing of Balderrasi Rossi, who was a young knight who had been inflicted with madness and was not, coherent or was not sane.
Sorry, let's back up a little bit. Let's go to the previous slide really quickly.
Yeah.
So is this, in that case, do we only have the testimony of the laborers? That was the only testimony we have in this case?
So far as I know, I'd have to look back at what Pastor Vici cites in that case, but I believe it was by the laborers who were there and by the friar. Usually these would happen near the monastery. So we have lots of testimonies from the friars who were, brothers of Joseph at the time as well. But it's not just from friendly audiences. Sometimes these were from peasants. Sometimes these were from educated people. Sometimes they were from royal politicians, as we'll get to in a minute. But we have a pretty wide range of witnesses in terms of education level, religious belief. They weren't all just superstitious clergymen who were looking for a miracle.
I want to jump in and start to assess and everything, but let's still hold off. Let's wait for that toward the end. That's kind of what I wanted to do on this one, but I'm just going to wait. Let's keep going through the different accounts.
Sure, we could pick apart each one individually, but I think looking them as a whole makes it as better assessment. So you have another case where, as I said, you have this knight who was inflicted with madness, and according to the witnesses who were there, Joseph picked him up by the hair, went into the air, and it's not exactly specified how long they were up there, but some accounts imply that it was several minutes at least up there. Joseph is still in this dazed state, and when they descend back down, Balderrasi is allegedly sane again. He's cured of his madness. So you have an account here that involves a levitation, strength because he's picking up someone with one arm by the hair into the air with him, and then you have a healing associated with it, right? So each one of these individually you could maybe try to write off, but having the combination of these as a factor, I think, makes it quite incredible. So unless you have any thoughts on that, I'll just keep going. I kind of want to go through these relatively fast just to not, overload everyone with the monotony of it all. But
well, if we go too quickly, it's gonna be an overload. I think let's go back really quickly. I don't know if we talked about this. Did you mention so this one we've got his companions, right? Mm-hmm. Those are the people that saw this. Do we know how many there were?
I don't know off the top of my head on how many there were regarding.
Well, it looks like by the picture or by the painting,
there were
half a dozen.
5. Yeah, and I don't know how accurate all the paintings are. Obviously, these are not photographs, so how much of that is artistic interpretation? Of course, you'd have to take that into account. But certainly, there's more. And you'll notice that in virtually every painting I think we have on here, they show the witnesses because that was very important. You wouldn't be allowed to admit the miracle into the procession unless you had a witness. It couldn't just be, I heard from my brother's uncle's cousin that so and so happened. Right? You have to either have seen it yourself or have directly interviewed someone who had seen it, right, in that way. So yes, it's very important to depict the witnesses in these cases, and you see that with most saintly miracles.
Something else I was going to mention is suppose that put yourself in their position, okay, in the position of these companions. You see this thing and you're like, what did I just see? And then how would you go about convincing people that this is what you actually saw? It'd be kind of difficult, and really the only thing that you would have that we would have access to would be something like their eyewitness testimony that's recorded and something like this. So this is exactly what we would expect if it happened. This is the best we could do if it happened back in the 17th century, right? This is the exact type of evidence that we would expect if it actually happened. So yeah, I guess wanted to make that point, kind of put yourself in their perspective and be like, suppose that you really want to convince people that what you saw actually happened. How would you do it? All you can do is tell people. And that's what we have.
Right. And again, we don't just have a person telling it. We have testimonies from many, many different people in many different cities and locations over the course of 60 years. So when you stack all of that up, it seems harder and harder to sort of just dismiss this as either a conspiracy or all a coincidence when you have people in one city saying they saw this, people in other cities saying they saw this over many, many years. So this was not just a one-time weird escapade that people might have been confused about. This was something that happened routinely and repeatedly, which is often what you hear with miracles. Like, why can't we repeat these? Why can't they be replica? Why is it always a one-off? In these cases, they certainly weren't one-offs. So I think that's just an important detail to mention.
Let's before we move to the next slide, let's take a couple super chats. How about that?
Sure.
So this one, previous super
Absolutely.
chat, but this one from Kyle Allender says, "We know people do not fly. Documentary debunked." Yeah.
I'm friends with Kyle. I can sense the sarcasm in that, and that's great. I actually was having that conversation with someone earlier today, unfortunately, where they were basically just saying, well, we know flying is impossible, right? And, the caveat is, well, how do you know it's impossible? Well, we've never observed someone flying before, unless you count Jospeh of Cupertino, in which case we have potentially observed it, right? But you can't have the argument where we know that flying doesn't happen because it's never been observed, and we know it's never been observed because there's been no credible case of it, unless you just dismiss the cases that we have of it. And the only reason you would dismiss it is because it can't happen. So it does come off as inherently circular. Yeah, people don't fly because no one's ever seen it, and if anyone's ever seen it, then they're lying because it doesn't happen. So in that way. So, I mean, it is a fair question to ask, because certainly we wouldn't just normally accept testimony that someone flew on a normal basis. And we're not asking anyone to just say that anyone who ever has claimed to levitate we should accept, right? As we'll go into, there's plenty of explanations you can usually give. But you have to look at the specifics of each case. And in the case of Jospeh, it far outstrips anything we have for even other people of that time, even other people today who make similar claims. So I think just the quantity and the quality that we have makes it specific that we need to look into it and take it more seriously than someone who said someone flew 200 years later in a foreign country, right? Just different conditions.
So next super chat from Joshua Pena. How many primary sources describe this? We kind of went over the primary sources earlier on in the presentation, but can you give us just a quick reference or summary of all of them?
Sure, yeah. So we have Roberto Nuti's biography written about within 15 years of Joseph's death. We have the second one, which we don't know the exact year, but within the second half of the 17th century. Both of those are contemporaries who knew Jospeh and knew people who knew him. Then we have Bernini's biography, which about 60 years later, which mostly uses the processi, which are documents that were compiled starting about 10 years after Joseph's death from eyewitnesses. And the subsequent biographies typically use Bernini's work as well as the processi and have different details. In terms of which case is mentioned in which biography, that one I'd have to look back into it. I do cite some of the ones there. Some of them are repeated in multiple of them. Some of them are only mentioned in one. It's kind of like the Gospels. You have varying miracles. Some of them are mentioned in every one. Some of them are only mentioned in one. People include different things. But as one of the biographies pointed out, he had only included 70 deliberately because he couldn't fit all of them in his book. So you shouldn't expect every single biography to have every single case, because there were literally hundreds, if not thousands, of cases that one could do, because this allegedly happened almost on a daily basis, especially towards the end of Joseph's life.
So cool. All right. Yeah, let's turn back to the presentation now.
Absolutely. So probably one of the more dramatic ones that we talk about in the documentary is the Inquisition. So at this point, Jospeh had been doing these miracles, and as you can imagine, people were very freaked out and very much in awe. And the Catholic Church at this point, this was after the Council of Trent, so they were trying to crack down on saint cults. And this was an increasing problem where people were very mystic. You had these very charismatic figures who allegedly did miracles, and they would attract a big following. And sometimes these individuals were not always the most credible people. They had really bad theology. They didn't always agree with the church. And so the church made a point to sort of stamp out any kind of cults that didn't align with them. And were very much not in favor of that. So anyone who had miracle claims of this sort would automatically be investigated by the Inquisition to see if they were fraudulent, if they were practicing witchcraft or trickery. And we do have, as Carlos Ayer mentions in your documentary, other cases of this where they were debunked. There were some cases of nuns who allegedly would levitate. People saw this. And when they were interrogating her, she confessed that she'd actually been using her high heels tipped, and the way that her robe was, she'd basically been pushing up on her tiptoes, and it looked like she was levitating a few inches off the ground, and people thought that she was. And so we have cases where the church looked into this and scrutinized it and was able to debunk cases where it was fraudulent, right? Now, of course, that's very different than someone like Joseph, who's levitating tens of feet in the air suspended for minutes at a time, not just a few seconds and a few inches. So it was very different. But when the church had heard these stories, they were very concerned. So Joseph was first brought to a tribunal, I believe it was in Naples, and they did not find any initial problem with him. They obviously thought it was weird. They told him to stop, and Joseph said that he couldn't stop, that he had no control over this. But they found his character to be admirable. Joseph really had a heart for God. He was a servant of God. There was no evidence he was doing this for attention, that he was doing this to gain power or money or control of people. It seemed like he genuinely just was going through this because he couldn't help it, but he had every sincere belief that he could in this. So they didn't find any evidence that he was doing this intentionally as a hoax for bad means in that kind of way. But this was taken up to a tribunal in Rome, where Joseph was brought before the inquisitors. And while he was waiting to meet the Pope and the inquisitors, he would be giving mass in one of the churches in Rome, and he levitated in front of some of the nuns and the inquisitors there. And of course, this surprised them. So then they take him before Pope Urban VIII, and Joseph is with his confessor there, his superior, and as he goes to kiss the Pope's feet, he takes off in the air, and he would remain there in the air until his superior would call him down. And that was a very common trend with Joseph. Usually he would be in the air dazed in a state where he couldn't really hear anything or interact, hence what people were doing to him earlier. And his superior would have to command him, Joseph, get down. And Joseph would then, hover back down and then wake up again. So he does this in front of Pope Urban VIII, and everyone is obviously shocked by this. And the Pope comments that if Joseph happens to die before I do, I personally will testify before his beatification to be a saint that I saw this. Now, of course, the Pope ended up dying before Joseph, so we do have the testimony of the people who were at the I'm trying to remember the word, the inquisitors who were there at the moment the Pope died before he could record it in the processi. But it is remarkable to see this, and there's multiple paintings depicting this. So as I said, we have a big list of witnesses, not just people who were peasants and hyper-religious, but skeptical inquisitors and even the Pope himself, who was, the most powerful person in the world at that time, to see this.
Yeah, and that's where we kind of ended the documentary, but as you say, there's a lot more to the story, and we talked a little bit about that. Do we have any more accounts?
Yeah, we do. So after this is when Joseph then gets, I was going to say banished, but gets relocated to Assisi. So he has to leave Cupertino and go to Assisi and try to play it on the down low. Unfortunately, he doesn't really play that down that much. The first day they moved there, this was on April 30th, 1639, so some of these we actually have pretty specific dates to. The friars who were moving with Joseph testified that Joseph saw this painting, and this is actually a painting that Joseph had previously had in his old monastery that he was a big fan of. It's the Montana della Cortella, which is a picture of the Virgin Mary holding Jesus, pretty well known. I think it was like a wood carving of it, actually, but oftentimes Joseph would go into these ecstasies when he saw religious imagery. Usually it would be statues or he would hear hymns, but most of these were specifically religiously charged. He would be taken up with it. So when he was moving, he didn't know how much of this stuff was going to come with him. So when they go into this new monastery in Assisi, Joseph is thrilled to see that his favorite depiction of Mary, they had taken it with them and they had packed it. And he literally says, "Mamma mia, you found me," and is in such a daze that he floats roughly about 90 feet across the floor and embraces this painting in front of the friars. And of course, they're taken aback. And even though some of them, the ones who'd been with him were used to it, the new ones who were at the Assisi monastery were shocked to see this, of him doing this huge leap, essentially over to this painting, or to this depiction of Mary. And so it was common for Joseph to embrace these in that manner. While we're in Assisi, I'll keep going unless you want to stop me. One of his most well-known ones happened when you had some Spanish dignitaries. These were generals, and I think like politicians, like governors, essentially, who were visiting Assisi, and they had heard the rumors about Joseph of Cupertino. He'd been pretty popular by this point, so they had wanted to see it for themselves. So they go in, they ask to meet Joseph, and so Joseph comes out of his cell, and as he comes out of there, he basically sees this altar that has a statue of the Virgin Mary on it. And he gets so overwhelmed with joy that he flies over to it over the heads of the dignitaries and embraces the statue, and then flies back and comes down. And this happened so quickly, and it absolutely terrified the dignitaries that were there. It actually says that some of them were shaking. Take in mind, these are generals who, fight in war. These are soldiers, so they've seen some stuff. They were absolutely terrified, but some of the wives of the men fainted, and they had to get smelling salts and get them back to consciousness. And we do know the specific witnesses of this. We have the testimony of Padre Provenzala, who was one of the friars that were there, and we also know that the witnesses here were Francesco Allegretti and Juan Alfonso Henriquez de Cabrera, along with others. And so we have named witnesses of this. It was this dignitary, this lieutenant, who had testified in the processi. So that's one of the most commonly depicted ones, and there's a little bit of humor there with literally the fainting of this. But if you were to see someone who you didn't know who just screamed, flew over your heads, and embraced a statue, you would probably be quite terrified and mystified by that as well. So that's probably one of the funnier accounts. And by the way, just to point this out, these are very educated, very respected. These would be, the equivalents of senators and generals and governors in our time. So we have we've seen so far people who were clergymen who saw this. We saw people who were peasants and shepherds who saw this. Now we had the Pope himself who saw this, and the inquisitors. Now we have politicians and the rich people who are educated. So we have a very wide range of witnesses. This is not just a few people who are super superstitious. These are people from foreign lands with different beliefs who are seeing these things. Speaking of different beliefs, another one that was controversial was actually a levitation that was seen by a Protestant that converted him. And it was notable because this was in 1649 and it occurred to Johann Frederick, who was a Lutheran Duke of Brunswick-Lunenburg at the time, and he was the mentor to Gottfried Leibniz. Longtime viewers of your channel will know Leibniz for the contingency argument, right, which he famously had done a version of. He was a very big mathematician and theologian who had come up with some brilliant aspects of, actual infinities and contingency and God's existence. Was a big apologist. But they were both, Lutherans. They were not Catholic. So Frederick was visiting Assisi at the time, and he came in, and to my knowledge from the story, Joseph had not been notified that they were coming. So he goes in there and he sees he and his dignitaries are sort of sitting in the back of the chapel at this point. They come in quietly. Joseph is there with the Eucharist, doesn't see them come in, and he's trying to break it, but he's having issues with it. And allegedly, from what the witnesses say, a black cross appears on the Eucharist, and Joseph cries out that he can't break it because there is someone unfaithful there who, there's a lack of faith, someone who doesn't believe in the real presence there. So Joseph then levitates it roughly about 12 feet backwards. So he's back is facing them. He flies backwards and lands on this. And one of the people who was with Johann, I forget his name, says, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I saw this and came to this damn country because I just have distress. What did I just see?" But Johann was more intrigued by this. And so he actually met with Joseph the following day and talked to him about just theology, and Johann Frederick actually ended up converting to Catholicism after this. We don't know if it was directly as a result of this miracle, but the lines add up. And Leibniz actually mentions this briefly. He doesn't specifically mention the reason, but he does mention that Johann went to Assisi, met with Jospeh of Cupertino, and then later converted to Catholicism. But doesn't go into the details as to why exactly that was. I don't know if he was unaware of it or he was uncomfortable talking about it, given his background as a Lutheran. But this is, an interesting case because it's witnessed not only by a Protestant who was probably hostile to Catholicism, would not have been overly receptive to Catholic miracles, but also the fact that Joseph is, levitating backwards. So we not only have Joseph in the air with varying degrees of height, whether it's a few inches, a few feet, with different durations, but now we also have different directions. He's levitating up, he's levitating backwards. I think there are accounts where he's levitating upside down. Quite a lot of variability in terms of what he's doing. So to pull this off as some kind of trick just seems more and more stretched in terms of credulity when you look at all the different things you'd have to be doing to pull off all these different maneuvers. So I think it's one of the more interesting cases. Anything you wanted to say there, Cameron?
Nope. I'm enjoying this.
Cool. I appreciate that. Another one that I'll talk about briefly, this is obviously not a picture of Joseph. I couldn't find a depiction of this specific one, but this was when he was in Fossombrone, so this was his second to last change. And this was witnessed by friars, so this one was not as public. But as they were doing a sermon or reading the scripture from John about the Good Shepherd, Joseph sees a flock of sheep that are hanging around the monastery. And so someone as a joke goes and puts the sheep on his shoulder and he's embracing it. And the thought of Christ as the Good Shepherd and the salvation for humanity warms his heart so much that this is really funny just describing it, but he says he literally runs, throws the sheep in the air, flies, and then catches it, hovers, and then basically lands on a tree. And he stayed in that way for about 2 hours or so, in that way, just in a dazed state, holding the sheep the whole time as the Good Shepherd. So you have another one where he's not just flying in the air at really high heights, but he's holding something while doing it, which obviously is not really physically possible. So just the description of thinking about that is almost like really silly. And there are really just weird accounts like that where Joseph will be on a tree, like almost like a bird, and sometimes you're really thin
in
trees,
the thin
like
branches.
Like really thin branches, and he's almost weightless, and he just is like has his tippy toes on there, but it's not weighting him down, in that kind of way. So really fascinating. There are other accounts that are kind of humorous where Joseph would fly and crash into someone, and because he's in a dazed state, he would just be laying there on top of the person. They're like, get him off of me. And he's not, they have to like move him off of them or something. So really, really strange accounts, but the variety of these is fascinating.
Yeah.
One of the more commonly depicted ones, and this is one that we were discussing before we went on air, occurred. This was towards the end of his life as he was being moved to his final convent in Osimo. This happened on July 6th, 1657, so one that we have an exact date for. But Joseph, when he was being moved, saw the house of Loreto. So for those of you people who don't know, the House of Loreto is a Catholic artifact that is a physical building. It's a house. And allegedly, medieval Catholics believed that it was the actual house of Jesus of Nazareth and the Virgin Mary from Jerusalem. And they believed that angels came and picked up the house and transferred it up to Italy. Now, how plausible that story is, I doubt that there's much historical reference for it. I haven't looked into it, but certainly most people will not find it very convincing that the fact that you have a Jerusalem-like house in Italy means that it was carried by angels there. So I won't get into what the actual house.
Yeah, the reason why they think that is because the Muslims were coming and destroying all the artifacts, the Christian artifacts, and so that's what they believed happened, is that angels came and took that so that it could be preserved and then moved it to this place. And there is some really, I won't say convincing, but I'll say there's some very interesting evidence. Archaeology and stuff has shown that the layout of the house matches stuff that we've seen in Israel. And then apparently some archaeologists have also found like remnants of different pollen that would have been in ancient Israel. So do those things together prove that angels were involved and moved it? No. But it's nevertheless like a very interesting, piece of history. So, but anyways, that's not important. The point is that that's just where this happened.
Certainly, yes. And this is what Joseph is seeing this from a distance, so he's not right up to it. But as he's basically on a porch in a nearby building, and the porch is just a few feet off the ground. It's not super high, but he sees this and he has a vision. According to the friars who were there who testified to this, he has a vision of angels, which is what you see in both of these depictions there. He sees angels, flying over these, and he says, like, "Oh, do you see them?" And they're like, "What, Brother Joseph? We don't see anything." He's like, "Do you see the angels there?" And then in this ecstasy, Joseph flies from the porch tens of feet, about 45 feet, and then lands on a nearby tree where he's perched there for a while out of the enthusiasm of this. So another one where he flies and lands on a tree in this way. But you do have the religious context there of having a vision of angels and having the alleged house of Christ there. So I think the fact that these are religiously charged is very significant in terms of it. Is this just some weird human ability? Because Joseph's would usually get triggered by seeing a statue of the Virgin Mary or a painting or thinking about the Good Shepherd or hearing the Bible or seeing the House of Loreto, right? These are all very specific to religious.
I was actually going to mention that, but so I'm glad that you did. Yeah. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes.
Right, exactly. And the last one one more thing I had to point out in this. I wrote here that he was 54 years old at the time, which I think is important because he's been doing this since he was in his early 20s in terms of the levitations. So when we get into some of the other explanations, the fact that he was doing this even when he was middle-aged, getting close to elderly for that time period, right, is pretty remarkable. And I also didn't mention until now that Joseph was like not in the best shape. He would always be fasting. He was thin as a rail, usually would smell terrible besides the miracle of the perfume stuff. But he would, have open sores. He would only eat a few times a week. because he was fasting. He would beat himself constantly out of reverence, very, very devoted, sleep deprived, constantly fasting, but was not in the best shape. He's not like the superstar athlete. And so the fact that he's doing these big distances while he's in bad shape, while he's middle aged, 54 years old, is remarkable. And it's not even something that I think most professional Olympic athletes could do, let alone a 54-year-old sickly man. So I think that's just an important caveat to have on there as well. And the last one I have on here, it's not one of the more remarkable ones in terms of height, but I think the context is interesting. And this actually is like verbatim a quote from one of the witnesses that we have. This was during a surgery. So this was the same year that Jospeh died. So this was, I think, a few months prior to this. Jospeh had gotten really sick, and he got these sores on his body. And back then it was common to cauterize these, right? They would put leeches on them. They would sometimes burn them. They would have bloodletting. That's what they thought was curing illnesses back in the day. So there was one time where elderly Jospeh was sitting in a chair getting his leg operated on. This is not a painting of the exact event, but an example of that kind of procedure where they were cauterizing the leg. And two surgeons, Francesco Pierpololi and Dr. Ciancino Corrosi, both testified to this, where Jospeh, while he was doing this, they looked at him and he was in a dazed state, right? He has his arms out like a cross. He has his eyes looking up to heaven. His mouth is open again. It actually mentioned that there was a fly that flies on his pupil and is just crawling there, like, and he's completely motionless. And they noticed that he's hovering a few inches, about 3 inches or so off the chair above that. And he's doing this for a good 7 to 8 minutes. And so they stop what they're doing. They look at each other. They're amazed. And they get down and they are basically looking at it. They're touching it. They're like, is he really floating? So you have one where people who are educated people for the time were actually feeling this out in terms of Jospeh was just there frozen, floating. People were feeling the chair, looking for anything that could have been a result of trickery, right? So these are conditions that were not up to Jospeh, that were not super, they were very controlled conditions to say. And we'll get into that, but when you're doing a levitation trick, you don't normally want people to be able to get around you, just feel it wherever you're at, right? So that's pretty remarkable when we have the first-hand testimony here. So as they're feeling this for, again, several minutes, this is not just like a quick thing. One of the friars walks in and is like, oh, is Jospeh doing that again? You got to call him by his name. He's like, Jospeh! And then Jospeh snaps out of it and then falls back in this chair, and they finish up the process. But we have the testimony of these people who said, yeah, he was floating a little bit off the chair, and we looked at this, and this lasted for several minutes as we were looking into it. So that's, I think, an interesting account as well towards the end of his life.
Yeah. Yeah, nothing else to add on this one.
Yeah, so those are the main ones. And again, if we did every single one that was documented, we would be here all night. So that just goes to show you the bulk of what we have. But those are the more interesting. I wanted to do a variety. Some of these accounts he's floating a few inches. Some of these accounts he's floating tens of feet in the air for several minutes. Some of these accounts he's holding things and grabbing things while doing it. So very wide variety of things here. So what about skeptical explanation now? Is there the idea that someone flew is so unintuitive to most people and so ridiculous to most people that surely we want to say that there has to be some plausible explanation, because people, even if you believe in miracles, people don't normally fly, and the details of the case are just so strange as to evoke some kind of explanation, right? So I think the one most people typically think of is illusion. Was this some kind of trickery that Jospeh was doing? There's different ways people can make themselves look like they're flying, right? If you look at the picture down there of Peter Pan on Broadway, which is commonly used now in stage plays, they have thin cables that are attached to pulley systems, basically, that move people up and down. And when you have proper lighting like you do there, it's really hard to see them. Although even in the picture, if you look really closely, you can kind of see them in that way. Now, this was big in the 1960s when this technology was invented. It shouldn't go to say that this was not available in the 1630s to 1660s when Jospeh was doing these things. They would have had ropes, but ropes are not the most thin things, and you can typically see them pretty obviously if you were being tied to ropes, right? Not to mention you wouldn't be able to do some of the feats of like going backwards and all of the stuff that we see there. So
yeah, and all the thin kind systems that they would have had to have.
Exactly. The thin cables that you see in productions not only didn't exist back then, but would have to work under very particular lighting. And take in mind, Jospeh was also levitating outside oftentimes. He's flying and putting a cross in there, where he's flying and holding on to a sheep outside and landing on trees. So just to think of there as being some pulley system that wouldn't have been like seen and being obvious is almost comical to think of. And there's no analogous case of anyone doing any kind of system like this from that time period in that kind of way. Then you have the Baldussi illusion, which is the picture of the top left. And this is something that people like David Blaine do. Sorry to spoil the stuff here, but you can put your feet at an angle. You face your back towards people. And if you're far enough away, you can like lift up on your toes. And if you do it from the right perspective, it looks like you're hovering a few inches off the ground. And that's what the nuns earlier were doing that were caught faking it, especially when they have like a longer robe that they're wearing. It's a little bit harder to see the shoes, but they can angle it to where they're doing that. Now, of course, there were times where Joseph was just levitating a few inches off the ground, but in a lot of those cases, people were actually feeling him up, right? He was frozen. They were pushing him. They were pricking him. They were feeling under his robe. They were feeling on his chair. There was one account where Joseph was doing this in a dazed state, and there were some shepherds there, and he's a few inches off the ground, and his robe is a little bit off the ground, and they actually go and they put their hands under the robe just to make sure. It's like, is he like standing, or is he? And they do that, and they don't feel anything, right? So when you're a magician, you do not want your audience. You need to do levitation from a distance. You don't want people to be able to come and touch things and investigate it and see it, because then they can find the trickery. They can see that you're just tiptoeing. They can see that you're
right. And that's exactly what this would have been. Is that it would have been an illusion. It would have been some sort of physical contraption, or lifting himself up off of his feet and stuff. And so the closer you get, you should be able to find something.
Exactly. Yeah. People are feeling it. And again, he's not misdirecting them or guiding them, telling them, hey, like touch here or something like that, like a magician. He's non-responsive. He's not talking during these. He's not interacting at all. So it'd be really risky to be doing this and having people just be feeling you in that way to not do it. And the fact that we have examples of people who were caught doing this acts as the control group, where we can test that theory to say, if this is what Joseph was doing, we would expect him to have been caught, because we have other examples from that time period of people being caught in this way. And yet we don't have that in that case. So, and of course that doesn't account for the ones that were really high in the air, really sustained anyway, but that way. And then you have forced perspective. Yeah, I have this cane illusion here. This is done by a lot of Buddhist and like Hindu yogis, where basically they have a device underneath the rope that they're sitting on, and it's connected to the cane. So they're essentially putting the weight on that, right, in that kind of way. But not only does this not fit with the description of what was described by Joseph, but this also was not really a technique that was used at the time in Europe, and it's not analogous to Joseph, levitating in the air, suspended in the way that he was. So I don't think that any of the proposed model ones are realistic in any way, unless one wants to say that Joseph was an ingenious inventor who created some method that even today would be remarkable, right? And it's almost like with the Shroud of Turin. It's like, we're going to propose this ingenious person who invents this method that we have no idea what the mechanism is, and then was forgotten about, and we still can't do today. That way, it's just very ad hoc, and it's also just so broad that it doesn't really predict anything. It's unfalsifiable in that way. So I don't think that's a plausible alternative. Do you think that's agreed in terms of the illusion hypothesis?
Yeah, the illusion alternative is definitely ruled out, like beyond unreasonable to believe that.
Yeah, and I think that's the least. I think that if we're ranking these, I have three broad explanations. I think this is the least plausible of the three, in my opinion. Like the one that I would say is the most unlikely to be the case. Next one is jumping, which sounds very simple, but it's more common than you think. There's lots of cases of alleged levitation. I have some photos here where the person was in the air for a second or two, and when you look at the photos, it kind of looks like they're floating, but you could also say they were just leaping in the air, right? The one on the left is especially well known. It's from a medium from the early 1900s and this was in the dark, by the way. The camera had to be lighted, but during a seance, he shot up in the air for about a second and fell down again. They were like, oh, this is psychic levitation. You have a boy on the right who is a child preacher in a Pentecostal church in the I think it was the 30s, named Little David, and he was filled with the Holy Spirit. He would hop up in the air, floating for a few minutes. And the one in the right corner is from the infield poltergeist.
Wait,
very well
floating for a few minutes?
No, for a second.
Okay, you said a few minutes. Okay.
I'm sorry, I meant.
But even a few seconds would have been a long time.
Yeah, popping up and down,
just a jump.
Yeah, just a jump, right. And the infield poltergeist, which is on the bottom right, this is a very well-known paranormal case of alleged photos of what looks like levitating, but people have pointed out that if you look at these photos, it looks like she's almost just jumping off the bed, and this is sort of a midair one. So, but nothing that looks like it would be sustained, right, in that way. And this is actually a theory that's put forward by Joe Nickell. He's a big skeptic. His name will come up a lot in some of these documentaries that we do, because he writes about a lot of these. He's like the chief skeptic, kind of like James Randi. where he basically proposes that some of these accounts are Joseph being a really talented gymnast who was jumping up in the air sometimes, and people back then, given their credulity, thought that this was, a miracle. And he says this because there were some cases where Joseph would scream and basically run a little bit, fly up, and then land somewhere. A lot of the time Joseph would land, he would grab onto something, right, in that kind of way. And so he proposes that Joseph a lot of the time was just jumping really high and grabbing onto things, and these kind of got told in that way. And he acknowledges that there are some accounts where Joseph is not holding on to anything and is also just in the air for minutes at a time. And he says, well, maybe he was holding on to something and they just didn't mention it. It was just written out of the account, which again makes his hypothesis completely unfalsifiable, because anything that you point to say isn't consistent, he can say, well, but it didn't happen that way. And so
he was getting operated on, and then he just jumped, and then
yeah, exactly,
for 8 minutes in the air jumped, and
and I said, and in some of these cases, Joseph is holding things, holding people, holding big metal crosses, like grabbing onto them, moving them. So the idea that he's just jumping and landing onto things, not to mention, just I think it's easier for us to look back and say people were credulous back then, but they knew what jumping was, and to have the heights that we're doing, and you could say there was some exaggeration, but to be able to fly over the head. Yeah, to say that they were flying over the heads of people or flying, 90 feet as a distance is such. You have to have such like an exaggerated, like in terms of what that would entail, right? Or like the heights that he was allegedly soaring up to on trees. It just stretches credulity to think that any of that it would like remotely be plausible. In fact, Dale Allison, who, as you know, is a pretty liberal scholar as it is, he mentions this in a footnote, and he says, if this is the best skeptical theory that there is for this case, then skepticism is basically just dead, because this is just terrible in terms of the proposition. Yes. So I think it's slightly better than the illusion one, because there are some cases you could say, well, maybe he's just jumping and people misremembered it or exaggerated, because sometimes he's only in the air for a few seconds. But again, it does not account for the variety of cases that we have.
It's equally bad. It's equally bad.
Yeah, it's pretty bad, and it's just comical to read the description and think that that's actually what's being described. But I'd encourage everyone to go read the article yourself and see if you find that consistent. But it's just wild to think of that. And the last one is I have on here, social contagion. So this is sort of the idea that a lot of these stories were, even if they stem from eyewitness testimony, were exaggerated, or people had, sort of the Bigfoot effect where someone sees it and they all want to chime and say, oh yeah, I saw it too. I remember that. Yeah, because they want attention, they want to get their name in there. And so people are claiming things and making up stories, or highly exaggerating stories, or misremembering them decades later because they want to sensationalize it. They want to promote Joseph as a saint. And so they are intentionally, maybe not intentionally, they're unintentionally having these accounts that maybe are partially based on a real event, or highly exaggerated, or maybe passed on or misremembered. And that's what we're seeing here, right? From something that was less impressive. And we do see this happening with other things. But again, I think that and I think that this is probably the has a little bit of plausibility compared to the other two, because you could say, well, since the accounts, even if the earlier ones were written down maybe 10 years later, even though that's comparatively really early, people's memories could fail and they could exaggerate or misremember certain details, or have leading questions asked to them. But I would also say to that memory is very broad, and although it definitely can be unreliable under certain circumstances, there's no such thing as just broad, memory reliability. It depends on when it's being told. And so if an event happens very quickly and is reported later on, yes, memory can be unreliable, but we don't just have that in that case. We have cases where Joseph was in the air for minutes, sometimes an hour at a time, very, very long periods of time, very dramatic periods of time. And these are not events that were mundane, but were shocking to people. This happened to people who were strangers of Joseph, people who knew him very well. So I think just the variety of witnesses and the variety of cities this happened in, and the variety of education levels, to say that everyone happened to sort of misremember these in such great details really stretches beyond the scope of believability. Yep. That kind of way, especially when you have firsthand testimonies. It's easy to misremember what color shirt was the person wearing, or what lane was the car driving on, or something like the studies we typically see. Where were you doing 9/11? But it seems really, really difficult to misremember. Oh yeah, I saw Joseph in the air about 10 feet there, and he was there for about 20 minutes. Are you sure he didn't just jump up for a few seconds and that's what you're remembering? The degree that you would have to stretch that, right? It wouldn't just be like, oh, he was wearing a different color shirt. It would be, oh, he had 4 arms and was breathing fire. It would be such a dramatic change of memory that it would almost be comical in that kind of way. So I don't really find that to be overly plausible either, especially just how many testimonies we have. The more you add up, the more unlikely it seems to get in that kind of way.
Yes.
So for sure. So going on the plausibility, we've already spent a lot of time critiquing the objections to it, right? But I will say I do have some issues myself in general. And part one of it is I think that this is a weird way to say it. I think it's just a weird case because you have this guy who can't control what's going on, who's screaming when he's doing these, who's in a dazed state at random intervals, sometimes when he's just seeing objects or hearing music. And the fact that we just don't have any good examples of this, it just seems like such a really strange example. And that's not really a knock against it, but it also means like I don't really know what to make of it in terms of theologically. It's almost like it's strange to think of God to just occasionally be picking up Joseph and flying him in the air just for the heck of it, right? In that way. So although this did occur in a religious context, the Vatican themselves actually did not use these to beatify him as a saint. They didn't disbelieve them. They accepted them. But because of sort of the weirdness of it, they actually canonized him based off of some of his healing miracles after he was dead. So it wasn't even the miracles themselves, which also adds to the credibility, by the way, because they weren't, again, using these to promote him as a saint. They were actually trying to discourage these stories. But the fact that the Vatican themselves were kind of off put by these and just didn't know what to do with them, quite frankly, I think makes me a little bit uneasy, and it makes me think that I don't know what to do with them. Also, being a Protestant, I will fully admit some of the details about him converting people and having it to where, the Eucharist won't break because there's an unbeliever here. It does come off as something that would be very much propagandizing Catholicism, like almost like it's against Catholicism, like how we have the miracles and you all don't, in that kind of way. So that does raise a little bit of a flag for me. And I think the fact that Joseph can't control these as well, and it seems sometimes these were like uncomfortable. He seemed like he was not having a good time during these, right? Makes me wonder if there was something more malevolent. And I don't usually like invoking demons, right? I think it's very ad hoc. But I will say that there's an interesting parallel. And you actually pointed this out earlier about the clothes not moving. If you look at accounts of Joseph flying, usually his robe, or his, I think that's the term of it, his habit would stay pretty firm, almost like he was like wrapped up in something, or he was in a bubble, but it wouldn't fly. You would think if someone's in the air, you think it would be draping, right? Like gravity pulling it down, but it wasn't. It was tightly wrapped around him, right? And what's really interesting about that is that if you look at cases of demon possession from medieval times and from even like, I think Justin mentions, oh, no, sorry, not Justin, who's the other, Jerome mentions a couple cases. There are a few cases in there where they talk about people who are levitating, who are demon possessed, who are levitating upside down or sideways, and their clothes are really tight on them. They don't drape. So it's kind of almost an undesigned coincidence that you have these two weird details matching together in that way, right? And so, on the one hand, it's like, well, that seems more than just a coincidence because it's a very specific weird detail to mention. So I'm not implying that it's demonic in that kind of way. The church didn't think it was. And I also don't know what motive a demon would have to do it, because clearly it brought people closer to Christ and made Joseph a saint. I can't think of any nefarious motive. But I do think that that's just an interesting detail to mention. So I don't really know what to do with it, but what do you think about this, Cameron?
Well, I wanted to actually ask you like where you sit on the plausibility scale. What number would you put it at? So for anyone who's just listening, the plausibility scale goes, it's a 1 through 5 scale. It's highly probable is number 1, or highly improbable is number 1. 2 would be unlikely. 3 would be possible. It's like it's possible that this happened. It's not likely, but it's possible. 4 would be likely, and then 5 would be highly probable. So where do you sit on this scale? Would you be maybe at a 3, maybe a little bit higher than a 3?
I think I'd be at a 3.5 if I can do decimals. I think I'd be a little bit less than a 4, but higher than a 3. And it also depends. Are we saying of this being a miracle by God, or are we just saying Joseph flying in general? Because those are, I think, slightly different hypotheses in that kind of way.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. So let's separate those. So take the hypothesis that Joseph was just flying, like not saying that God was the one orchestrating this, but that he was literally flying in the air. That's the hypothesis. Where do you sit on that on the plausibility scale with that hypothesis?
I would say it's close to a 4, probably like a 3.8, 3.9.
Okay, so likely,
So
so
we say
likely this dude was
relatively.
flying around.
Yeah, and I'd say in terms of it being God, I'd put that probably to 3.5, where it's possible. It's a little bit more than possible given the religious context, but because there's so many unknowns for me, I think that it does stop for that a little bit. I do like what Carlos Ayres says, though. I think that he makes a good point to say historically, just with the historical method, we can't say with huge confidence that Joseph actually flew, right? What we have is people, what we can say historically is that there were
Yeah,
hundreds of people who really believed that Joseph flew. And when you ask why did they believe that, and you go through the other explanations, it's hard to come up with the reasons to why they really believe Joseph flew unless they really did see something that looked like he was flying. How did he make himself look like he was flying? I mean, the other models I don't think are very plausible. So one of the models you could say because he actually was flying, right? And that's one way to say it. But I think that that answer is so crazy to some people that it's they would just dismiss it outright and want to go with something else in that way.
yeah. This may shock you. I think I'm close to like a 4.5 on the scale.
Wow.
Yeah, and the reason for that is there's a few reasons, but one of them is that the alternative hypotheses are really unlikely. So like we went over a few of them already, but that's really important when you're actually trying to assess the probability of something is you got to look at the alternative hypotheses, and if all of those are unlikely, then it sort of bumps up the probability that the other hypothesis that you're considering is more likely. But I think what also sort of pushes me that far is that because something that actually you were pointing to that made you less sure about this whole thing, and let me pull us both up on the screen here so we can just kind of chat.
Yeah.
The weird details of all the different levitations, like why was he screaming? Why is everyone reporting this? Why is he like screaming and then he's in the air for several minutes? And then you have, hundreds of people talking about this. You have thousands of eyewitnesses. Obviously there were more eyewitnesses than were recorded down. So like there's got like something happened. And the reason why I think that the hypothesis that God was involved, I think, is more likely is because that these all happened in a religious context, and that's something that we talked about earlier. Is that he would look at he was at the house of Loretto, and he would then he just started levitating as the thought of Mary, whatever else. And it's like these happened in a specific context while he was performing mass, or in the one case with what was it, Johann Friedrich, like he was Frederick. He was presenting the Eucharist, and then he just started floating backwards. And yeah, the religious context of this, I think, raises the likelihood that God is involved with this. Otherwise, like, what is the hypothesis? Like, if it's, if he was seen hovering in the air, floating in the air, if that actually happened, which I think it is likely that happened, then what explains that? What sort of non-God hypothesis are you going to be appealing to? Are you going to come up with some new law of nature? Are you going to come up with some like, scientific type, science-y, futuristic, maybe aliens are involved? Like what is the hypothesis if it's not God? And then, how do you explain the religious context of it as well?
I know you say that in jest, but Carlos Ayres in an interview actually said that he had I think it was an engineer, like a physicist, reach out to him and said, I love your book, and it actually helps with my theory of like a certain kind of time that I think Joseph was like literally like going through different dimensions or something like crazy like that, because he's like, oh, Joseph would like freeze up and time would almost stand still and his clothes wouldn't move, and he was in some weird dimension. Very weird sci-fi stuff that Ayres didn't really take seriously, but he thought it was interesting that someone
I mean, I would even think, like, even on that hypothesis, and maybe it's because I'm so convinced that the laws of nature ultimately find themselves like grounded in the existence of God. So if there was something that he was somehow tapping into, I would still want to say that God is involved in that process. So like if he was tapping into some like time dilation, or time was like being stopped in something and then he was being raised up and floating around and whatever else, I would still think that God is involved in that somehow. And it could point to some sort of like future state that we're going to be in or whatever else, if God does have that plan for us. So
and
yeah,
I don't is weird, because it's like, if we do grant that, why would God be doing this? Is it as a sign of indication to other people, or is this for Joseph's own spiritual fulfillment, or both? I could see it being that, because Joseph, was raised, he was looked down upon, he was stupid, no one took him seriously. So maybe this is sort of a comeback, like a phoenix rising from the ashes kind of story, where like God doesn't care how smart you are. God can use anyone, even someone who's otherwise disenfranchised and not taken seriously. Maybe God's vindicating that, or maybe God is vindicating the gospel in general to promote the faith during a time when Protestants and Catholics were very much hostile towards each other. Maybe it was something like that. We can only speculate God's intentions, right? So that does make it a little bit more murky for me to think of it. And I think the bigger question too that everyone's naturally going to ask is why do we have this happening 400 years ago? Why don't we have more cases of this happening today when there's cameras, right? And I think there's a few things with that. One is there actually are cases that are relatively contemporaneous that are there. They're not as well documented as Joseph, but you do have eyewitnesses to stuff like bilocation and levitation. Padre Pio is a good example, a very well-known Catholic saint. That was like 1930s, 1940s. And then you have Yvonne, and I'm trying to remember what her last name was, but she was Yvonne. She was a French nun who actually allegedly bilocated. She was helping Jews during the Holocaust and was helping them. And she would actually like appear in the concentration camps and help people and get people. It was a really crazy story, allegedly from that. But she died in the 1950s. So again, we're dealing with cases that are still within living memory of people who were alive at the time, young or recently died, right? We're not saying hundreds of years ago. We're talking about a time when cameras and recordings existed and during World War II, which is pretty well documented. So you do have modern cases of this. I'm not saying that they're all credible, but they're out there. They're just not super common. And the fact that it's an older case, I think, goes both ways. Obviously, we could always want to have cameras and have scientific, analysis of it in the best way we could, but it also means that it's harder to fake, because if someone levitated like that today in a crazy way, you could always say, well, maybe NASA has some really decked out tech that they're hiding from us, and this is all part of that, right? But the fact that we definitely know that stuff didn't exist 400 years ago, I think it would be harder to explain that than it would be today, where you could say that maybe it's something with magnets or something, because we have more sophisticated technology. So it kind of works both ways. The older miracles are harder to explain.
Yeah, on the point of God having like different reasons, what would be God's reasons for doing something like that? I actually asked ChatGPT to come up with some just possible reasons that God might have to perform a miracle like this, and it came up with some interesting results. So I think God could have reasons to do something like this. Well, one of them is that it suggested is union with God. You know how like, at least in the case of Joseph, St. Joseph, he was like very devout, right? And so it's going to show you, it's going to show, it's basically going to be a sort of outward symbol of his inward devotional life, and how like this is kind of like the outward working of someone who is intensely devoted to God. And so it could operate sort of symbolic in that way. There's other reasons we don't necessarily need to get into them, but I think it's possible that there would be a reason that something like this could happen. So I don't find it too implausible. And I also think that God would be the best explanation for why, like, if we do grant the hypothesis that Joseph was seen hovering in the air, floating in the air, flying in the air, whatever, I think God would be the best candidate explanation for why that was happening. And also, I mean, that's part of my, as a Christian, that's part of my explanatory resources, is appealing to something like God in those cases where it's hard to explain naturalistically why something like that might happen. What's also interesting that we've talked about it a bunch is the fact that like his clothes were still, and it seems like there's still something going on while these things are happening, that there's a sort of consistency between the counts. Right? There's a consistency of what's happening to his body, the way that he looks, the fact that he's like kind of in a daze, and you have to like call him out to get him back down to the ground. It's almost like there's some sort of weird law of nature that applies in this case. And again, my view on the laws of nature is that ultimately they find their source in the existence of God. So it could be that God has some other, it could be some other dimension. It could be some other set of laws that apply when something like this is happening, and that's what would explain the consistency between the different reports. But it's like so interesting, so weird, and I'm kind of trailing off here, but yeah, I think all the weirdness of it actually does lend credibility to it. It's almost like I was thinking about the connection between this and like the resurrection of Jesus and stuff and the accounts that we have there. And, you know, the fact that the women discovered the empty tomb first, like that's something that apologists often appeal to, because there's something called the criteria of embarrassment, where embarrassing details are a little bit more likely because they would actually be something that you wouldn't expect someone who's making up the story to include, right? You wouldn't expect someone who's making up a story to include details that would be embarrassing for them. So like if someone, say Peter, was making up these stories, then we would expect him he would be the one who would find Jesus or find the empty tomb instead of
the fact that the church was hiding Joseph and was not like promoting this as here's our miracle, everyone believe and convert to Catholicism. They were hush hush and we don't want Joseph. Joseph's a problem. They were uncomfortable with this. I think shows that this was not just some propaganda campaign they were promoting. They want people to believe. They were embarrassed by it and were wanting to not talk about it.
Exactly. So the fact that there's like these embarrassing details might add some credibility to the case. I mean, and the embarrassing part of the story that I think is relevant is like the screams. Like, why was he screaming when and then he'd raise up in the air and then he'd scream again and come back down? It's like, why include that detail? What does that have to do with anything? That just seems weird. Like, right. That doesn't seem like to be some sort of symbol of devotion, right? That doesn't like express any kind of unity with God. And then you're in the air. Like, what does that have to do with anything? I feel like that detail lends some credibility to these accounts. But
yeah, for sure. That and just being frozen in a state of God, where a fly just can come and go on your pupil, like just weird stuff like that, and the fact that they were poking him and blowing on him and all this stuff. It's kind of cruel. But yeah, obviously some people were fascinated by it, but there were people, as you saw, that were terrified, like fainting when they saw this. And I wouldn't blame them. If I saw someone scream at me and fly up, I probably would almost faint too. It would be terrifying. Yeah. So it's really weird for sure. But it's one of those that's Jospeh of Cupertino is probably one of the most interesting people in history. I don't have an issue saying that in terms of just the story. And I wish it was more attention. Era's book is doing a good job of getting that out in the mainstream, but it is genuinely fascinating.
Let's get to another super chat from Slam RN, one of our moderators. She says, could it have been caused by demons manifesting? Demons have shown unusual strengths into humans, the man at the tombs, for instance, whom Jesus freed. So I think there is actually a connection, but not in the way that, like, I don't think it was caused by demons, but I think that there is a connection between the sort of levitations of the saints and the levitations that get reported in these demonic accounts, their demonic possession accounts. I think it's tapping into something, some sort of supernatural realm. And that's about as specific as I can get. I think it's tapping into the same sort of resources, physical resources. But I think the reason why, in the case of like Teresa of Avila and other saints and stuff, why we know that it's not demons, because one of the sort of necessary components in these demon possession cases is an aversion to anything holy. And these people were devout Christians who were immersed in the holy. They were immersed in the sacraments. And typically in these cases, at least when I've discussed with exorcists and other people who are very intimately working on these cases and whatnot, any sort of like even just walking toward a chapel can cause a manifestation immediately in the case of like someone who is demon possessed. So if that were the case, it would be extremely unlikely that these sorts of events would occur, while he was presenting the Eucharist, or while he was at Mass, or he walked up to the House of Loretto and saw it and stuff, and then he just started manifesting as he was thinking about the Virgin Mary. Like, I don't know. None of that sounds plausible. So, but I think that there is something like it's tapping into the same like physical resources, physics wise. I just don't think it's demons. I think that it's just on the opposite side.
Yeah, levitations with saints is more commonly associated with the divine, but Protestants actually, especially during like the witch trials, did associate levitation with witchcraft. Era has a whole chapter on that, but Protestants mostly dismissed any cases of levitation as from the devil and like as evidence of that. And that's why it was risky to be doing these things. And the church did originally suspect that with Joseph. I mean, they didn't have any evidence it was demonic, but they were concerned about it. And they never denied the actual levitations, but they were concerned with the motives. But they found Joseph to be sound in his theology. He wasn't trying to deceive people with false beliefs or anything that was obviously like incorrect with the faith. So yeah, I don't like positing demons. I think it's very ad hoc, and any religion's miracles who you don't like, you can just say, well, demons did it, and that's a double-edged sword. A Muslim can just say that a jinn raised Christ from the dead, or had the illusion of raising Christ from the dead to start Christianity or something. It is a really ad hoc theory that's unfalsifiable. So I don't think it's ever really a good explanation unless there's other reasons to suspect it, like Cam said, where there's aversion to the holy or something like that.
So one of the skeptical hypotheses that we didn't really take seriously is the hypothesis of incredulity. We haven't talked about that one yet. So that's I think going to be the main response we're going to get to this video, if there are atheist responses, is this stuff is stupid, this stuff is silly. That's going to be their alternative hypothesis, is just to dismiss it. So maybe we should come up with some sort of response to that. I mean, there's not much you can say in response to an incredulous stare, but let's try to give something. What would you say to someone who's just like, you guys are dumb. This is obviously silly, made up.
I mean, look, people can assert all they want, right? And I contend that this is a very weird case that I was not. When I first heard about it, I thought it was, this is some case that was hundreds of years later written. There are lots of saint stories that are not credible, but I think just the extent of evidence we have, it should at least compel someone to think that something happened, and to just dismiss it a priori as a Humean example. It's actually funny that we say that too, because David Hume, of course, who they're essentially getting their epistemology from, he's writing about 100 years after Joseph, and he's talking about all these Catholic cases, and he basically says there's no miracle that has a sufficient number of educated witnesses. They all come from barbaric third world country, his words, not mine. Basically, they all come from non-white countries in his time. But of course, there were cases in Europe like Jospeh of Cupertino that were very well known. In fact, Joseph was getting canonized about the time Hume was writing his essay. It doesn't mention a word of it. Doesn't even feel the need to bring it up in terms of that. So to just dismiss these a priori, I think, is a naturalistic bias. Now, you could say the prior probability is very low. I can contend that. But if you do think that God is at least plausible, or the supernatural is at least a workable model that's not extraordinarily unlikely, we should be open to these and be very skeptical of them, sure, with reservation. But we can't just assume a priori that these things don't happen because we've never personally experienced them. The fact that most people don't fly in the air is not evidence that Jospeh of Cupertino himself did not fly from the air, because you could say, well, yes, most people we observe don't have divine intervention where God's lifting them from the air, but that doesn't mean that an agent like God couldn't lift someone else from the air at a different period of time. So there's just no way you can take a historical claim and make that kind of extrapolation based on what we see in the modern world. And to just say things like, certain people like Apologia, I don't know to bring up names, will say where no testimony can fulfill a miracle claim. They act as if testimony is just this one bubble that is just anything that's claimed by a person, right? But testimony is not just one category. There's plenty of different kinds of testimony. There's first-hand testimony, there's enemy testimony, there's testimony under controlled conditions. Whether we like it or not, most scientific publications are based on testimony. Unless you and I are in the lab fact-checking everything they say, there is an extent to where we and the peer reviewers take their word on it, right, to a certain extent. And although you could in principle replicate it, although you often can't with sociology, it's very difficult to do, and no one takes the time or effort and money to do it, right, because we take people's words at it. And the reason we take their words at it is not just because we are credulous, it's because that kind of testimony within the scientific realm is very careful. It's very controlled. You have multiple witnesses who are doing repeated tests under controlled conditions. And with Joseph, although we don't have obviously flat out scientific experiments, you do have multiple witnesses repeatedly under controlled conditions where people are feeling around, people are touching him, people are prodding him, conditions where illusion could have been suspected, could have been identified. You do have sort of a proto-scientific assessment in that way. So that kind of testimony from hundreds of people of different walks of life, different beliefs, from both believers and non-believers like Protestants, with variety that are still consistent, that kind of testimony is very compelling and I think should be taken very seriously.
Yeah, I guess my response to that objection is these days I don't really care too much about trying to convince people. So if someone is like trying to, well, maybe I should rephrase that. I don't really care too much about trying to convince people that have just like this staunch, they're sort of settled in their position and no evidence that you give them is going to convince them. Those are the type of people that I don't really have a ton of time for. And I feel like that's the type of person who is giving this type of objection is, I don't really take it seriously. I mean, you got to do a little bit better than that. You got to do a little bit more work. You got to offer some sort of explanation. You got to do something. Give me something. Give me something that I can kind of sink my teeth into and at least try to assess. And that's one of the things that's going to be, I mean, I think actually that's what's fueling the incredulity response, rather, is that there are no plausible alternatives in this case. And so what can they do? They can really like laugh at it. They can express like, oh, it's stupid. And that's about the best that they can do. And that's often that's the best that they can do when I'm interviewing these exorcists and stuff, is really demons. And it's like, okay, well, explain it. Like, just give me some sort of explanation as to what we're hearing from these people who are just reporting straightforward things that they've seen that are physically impossible. Give me the explanation. What is the explanation? They can't do it. And I think that's what's kind of going on here. So I don't take it too seriously. I don't think that we should spend too much time trying to convince people that are just, really deep down seated in their position. I think ultimately for that type of person, we just need to pray for them. That's the main thing that we can do to, if we're going to have any kind of positive impact on them, would be to just pray. So, and I think it's not just me saying that. There's other people like J. Warner Wallace who categorizes, and I think also Frank Turek, that talks about people who are just determined to believe something contrary to what you're claiming, and there's nothing you can do. There's no evidence that's going to convince them otherwise.
Yeah, and I try not to read into people's intentions or psychoanalyze. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but I think that it's important when people just say, well, it's we can't do a God of the gaps. It's something, and we just don't know what it is. We don't have to posit God, right? We're not saying Joseph flew, therefore God. We very meticulously went through to say this was in a religious context. Here's all the examples of that, why it's relevant, why it makes sense under theism. And then we contrasted that with the alternative hypothesis, say it's not plausible under those models. So we're not just saying something weird happened, we don't know, must be God. The context very explicitly implies that, I would think, right? And so for people just to say some unknown explanation that's not God, I think that's way too broad and also just not falsifiable, right? It's basically just doing what Graham Oppy does and just saying, well, anything, I can just play the game and say it's something that's natural, that's just not God, right? And I think you need to press them on what is it, though? Is it mechanism? Are you saying it's something with wires? Like, can you get specific? Because if it's just something that's so broad, exactly, you could posit that for literally anything. You could say the moon landing was faked with advanced technology that we don't have or don't know about it. But I don't have to explain how they faked it. I can just say, and you can't disprove that it was some technology that just made it look better. Like, it's unfalsifiable and it's not helpful unless you can press them on what kind of model they're proposing. And I don't think they want to do that, because when you start to press them on the model, most of them don't hold up.
All right, well, why don't we go ahead and start to wrap up the show? Is there anything that we've missed that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
Go watch the documentary if you haven't, and I'd highly recommend Carlos Ayer's book or Michael Grosso's book. Really great resource if you want to get your feet in the water on this subject. But yeah, I'm glad I could be here today. Thank you for inviting me. And I think topics like these are very under-discussed and are very useful theologically and apologetically, and I hope that with our documentaries in the future and with this stuff, people will find this as a very helpful resource for their own faith or for promoting this. And I think that the argument for miracles is underrated. That's why I'm writing a whole book series on miracles right now. So I think this stuff is really compelling personally, and people will think I'm credulous, but I try to be as fair as I can. And I think that in this presentation, I've tried to be as objective and as analytical as I can. And that's all I can say, is that I did my best.
All right. Thanks, Caleb. Thank you guys for watching. Go watch the documentary. It's linked in the description of this video if you guys haven't seen it. Also, share it. Share it with your friends. Share it with your family. I know I've seen a lot of people already share it. So hopefully over the years it gets more traction. More people learn about this incredible account. So thank you guys for watching. We'll see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you guys. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like, you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?